Hey everyone, welcome to Scouting Session episode number 11. I'm Jérôme Bérubé, and once again, I'm joined by Brad Allen. Hey Brad, how's it going?
It's going well, Jérôme. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good, Brad. So last week, we talked about players we missed on the during the 2019 NHL Draft. So that was an episode that didn't make us look too good. So this week, we're gonna try to look a bit better than we did last week. We're gonna talk about the players that we feel we got right in the 2019 NHL Draft, and we're gonna start with Moritz Seider of the Detroit Red Wings, who went sixth overall in the draft. We had him 10th on our final list. Obviously, looking back now, he probably should have been higher, but if you look at different lists back then, like nobody had him where we had him. So, Brad, maybe you can start with maybe your opinion of Seider back then, and what have you seen from him since 2019, and he won the Calder Trophy for Rookie of the Year in the NHL, and he's obviously been the cornerstone player for the Red Wings since the last 3-4 years.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's looking like he's going to end up as a true number one defenseman if given enough time to develop, which obviously signing that big contract in Detroit will allow him just that. So Seider is extremely important when it comes to how you evaluate prospects because he's a example of what happens when you take a very gifted two-way defenseman and give him limited minutes in a pretty decent pro league. So he was playing the DEL, and he was only averaging, what was it, like 12, 13 minutes a game, I think, Jérôme.
Yeah.
And it didn't give him a ton of opportunity to show scouts what his untapped offense really looks like. And in order for us to try to figure that out and mind that, we had to watch him at the U18s. We had to watch him at the U20s. We had to watch him at the World Championships. And the World Championships for us is where he really solidified his placement because he was just so intelligent and he showed a remarkable range of adaptation at that level, at that stage in his development. So the U18s, I would argue, is where he flashed the most offensive talent. But even then, it did not look top pairing to us. The catch and release was soft. His hands were more dexterous than we initially interpreted out of the DEL when we were watching him play pro. But I think it was more like, okay, this looks like a for sure top four defenseman, but we actually leaned a bit more insulator until the World Championships, where he showed such adaptability and so much hockey sense that we're like, okay, hang on. It doesn't even matter if his skill set isn't that dynamic because he'll just be able to get his A2s through his breakout passes, his exits, his ability to just find the exact seam that he needs at the right time for his passing. And his shot from the point was not bad by any stretch. So we thought of him as more like fundamentally basic, not overly creative, and certainly not dynamic. And I think when you look back and you see like where a lot of public lists had him, I would argue the main reason is because a lot of public scouting service or scouts, they look for a lot of flash and dash. They're looking for Makars and Quinn Hughes. They're not really looking for the type of player that Moritz Seider is and think that he could actually go up that high up in a lineup. So he is the representation to me on the back end of how difficult it can be to determine growth rate within the offensive production of a defenseman who's 6'4", 6'5", 6'6", and has untapped potential. So, our rule of thumb ever since has really been if the kid's 6'3.5", 6'4", and has shown some untapped flourishes at the junior level, give him benefit of the doubt if he's playing pro the whole year. It's just like Stanislav Svozil. It's a very similar circumstance. You got to be very careful how you monitor pro players. Filip Hronek is another, who was also drafted by Detroit, right? Filip Hronek didn't show that much flash in his initial draft season when he was playing in Czechia, but then internationally he would show a bit more. And that's exactly what Seider did. It's what Svozil did. And so it's one of those situations where you got to be very careful when it comes to how you're going to monitor the offense of these players.
Yeah, just a quick information. So you just mentioned the U18. So actually, Germany didn't play in the U18 that year, but there was a tournament in December that was a U18 tournament. To me,
okay, that's what I was referring to.
Yeah,
that's what I was referring to. Yeah, that
tournament. That tournament was really where we saw, we've got something with that player at this tournament. It was, I believe, it was late December. So he didn't play at the U20. It was like a second division U18 tournament. very. I believe was in Switzerland, if I'm not mistaken. He was really good at that tournament. As scout would try to figure out players, watching them with their teams, but it was really hard to do that with his pro team because he didn't really play a lot. He didn't play in any offensive, he didn't play in the power play. So we just saw a big guy that could defend, that could skate, at like probably untapped potential, but until you see it, you don't know. I think I remember that tournament was a bit of that turning point. I'm like, I think this kid is at least top 15. And the more we watched, the more we got confident in it in the second half of the season. But obviously, the world championship at the end of the year was where we decided like this guy has to be in our top 10. Looking back, should have been higher than 10, but it was somewhat of the beginning of a new era of German hockey. So we saw it Seider in 2019. And the year after that, you had three really good players in Stützle, Peterka, and Reichel. I was going to say all three went in the first round. No, somehow Peterka didn't go in the first round. But anyway, so that was a bit of the, of a new era of German hockey with those four players. I think also he's somewhat of a new era defenseman that I like to call like those. I feel like. With him, and then we saw more of those defensemen in 220, 221, 222, and 223, 224. Those big mobile defensemen that have like very good athletic ability, and we saw. I think more and more NHL teams were like, those guys are so valuable in the playoff. We need to get we need our team to draft those guys. I think that's why Steve Yzerman. You saw a bit what how he built his defense in Tampa Bay. That was very I believe that was his first really big move with the Red Wings. He got his big horse on the back end. He had Victor Hedman in Tampa Bay. I mean, Seider is not 6'7", but I think he saw Seider as like he's gonna be my big horse on the back end that can play 25 minutes a game, can get me probably in his prime, he's going to give Detroit probably between 50 and 65 points per season. A guy that you can match up against anybody in the NHL, can play a physical game as well. Those guys are so important for teams to have. And the scene was hilarious. Seeing people, the reaction of people at the draft was really funny. Seeing like reaction online also was really funny. Like I know some people that had Seider rank outside the first round. So like I imagine us, Brad, like we rank a guy outside the first round and he goes number 6 overall, like we would like lose our mind. That's what happened. That remains one of the best, pick we've seen in the recent years. Like I love when teams just trust themselves. They don't care about like public opinion. We like this guy. We're just gonna take him, and I don't wanna curse on here, but like after the rest, basically, we're picking our guy, and we're confident in our ability to scout and develop players, and this has really turned out pretty well for the Red Wings. So if we move to maybe our second player, Brad, and he's another defenseman, and it's Philip Broberg out of the Edmonton Oilers that took him 8 overall. Now he's with St. Louis. We didn't really have Broberg that high in the draft. So he went 8. We had him 21st on our final list. So we were not surprised that he went high because that's most people had him around that range, I think. We really questioned the hockey sense from him. We often talk about the athletic ability. Broberg had those. Really an awesome skater. He didn't process the game well. His playmaking was very average at best. I think that's been a reason why he has struggled in the NHL with the Oilers. Things were looking a bit better with the Blues before he got hurt. Very interesting pick. And to me, my big question with that pick, and I wish I knew the answer, is what happens with that pick if Detroit doesn't take Seider? Do do the others still take Broberg at 8, or they're going with Seider? Like I wish I was like a fly in the wall during those meetings to see the others. We didn't like that pick by the others, obviously, but if they pick Seider at number 8, we would like, be like, hey, that's a great pick for them. So I'm really curious to see if maybe one day someone's gonna write a book about this and we'll know the answer about who the others had as their like number one defenseman. Well, maybe not number one defenseman. Bowen Byron probably be that guy, but like for that pick, I do wonder like if Seider was the guy the others wanted, and they end up having to go with the next defenseman on the list. Maybe we'll never know, but very interesting case for Broberg. Brad, I'll just let you go here. We had a lot of discussion about Broberg back then, and I'll let you go. What was your feeling about that pick?
Well, we expected it, but it was one of those situations where you said it was when you look at the modern day defenseman, what they're capable of doing with him. He was a specialized defenseman where it's like, how far can skating really take you? That was his game. His game was to skate the puck. As defensemen, typically we always want to see, beautiful playmaking ability before we even get to the skating. Right. Because even if you're like just a good to above average skater, depending on the defenseman, if you have a brilliant playmaking game, it can get you out of trouble and you don't have to rely on your skating as often or drive as often. But in the case of Broberg, the playmaking was average. And we knew it was average, and we knew he wasn't a very smart hockey player. So we knew that his skating was basically going to make or break him. And up until he went to St. Louis, it looked like it was going to break him. But admittedly, he for those Blues fans, I know some of you out there are probably like, oh, he was only all right. He's looked amazing. I know he's looked a lot better. It's just the consistency rates. Can he keep it there? And I bring up the consistency rates because in his draft season, when he was playing the Allsvenskan, he had one good performance for every 5 games. It was just not a consistent player. Internationally, he blew up the Hlinka, which is what put him on the map, and I think honestly still one of the reasons he was over-scouted. But if you really looked at his league play and not internationally, you really saw the limitations when you were dealing with pro hockey players. So it's one of those situations where I think Edmonton, I mean, I've talked to the director of scouting on Edmonton about Broberg a couple of times, and like they were well aware of like what they had to do to mold him. They knew that there was a bit of a limitation there with a sense. They really thought the athletic base could compensate for it enough, and he could still drive possession at a very high rate. And admittedly, on St. Louis, it looks like it is starting to materialize. So it's one of those situations where I wonder if that would have happened in Edmonton as well, if given enough minutes to play. But it's Broberg goes against kind of how we evaluate the position. Like he's not the best defensively. He doesn't read the play that well in advance. He's not a tactician. He doesn't mentally map the ice well. He doesn't process passing plays under pressure very well. It's all about the athletic toolkit. And we don't get me wrong. We all love the athletic toolkits, but you want to go, a bit more to go with it at that range where Edmonton took him. So I think we've done a very good job of evaluating this player, but it will be interesting to see if he can bump up his ranking again, if he is what he's shown in St. Louis full time.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, he got hurt, so that was a bit of a tough break for him. But and he was off to a pretty good start with them, so maybe we'll regret putting him on this list. But so far what we saw from him in Edmonton and the American Hockey League when he played over there was not very, it was not looking too good. He was fine, I think, in the playoff last year, Brad. But even though it was still not top 10 worthy of a pick, I think, from what I saw last spring. So at this point, I think we're pretty confident that we think like this was not like the best pick at number 8 for the Oilers. And speaking of the Oilers, their arch rival Calgary Flames are the next team we're going to talk about with their pick, Jakob Pelletier, who was the 26th overall pick in that draft. So that's an interesting situation here with that player because we had him 39 and he went 26, and most people had him as a first rounder, like the top 32 guy. And I guess I'm a bad guy because I kind of liked the player, but he has like there's some part of his games that are missing. Obviously, at 5'9", and he was not the best skater. So right there, that's a bit of a red flag. As good as he can be, he's a hard worker. He's smart. He's always been the leader on his teams. But if he was bigger and faster, maybe you could argue he could have been a Philippe Danault type player. But just being 5'9" and not 6'1", and being an average skater and compared to Danault, who's a great skater, that's potential is very different here. And also, so he had a lot of points in his draft year with the Moncton Wildcats, who were like a very good team that season. He had 89 points, which is really good in your draft year. But one thing that was interesting about him, I remember that stats while prepping the show. 89 points in this draft year, but 40% of his point total that season were he got those points. So I believe that was 36 out of 89 points. He got those points against the two worst team in the league, which was St. John and Acadie Batters. So I think the 89 points was not really a realistic stats for him, because usually if you have 89 points in your draft year and you're like a smart two-way center, like that usually leads to you being a really high draft picks. But you take that into consideration, the amount of points he got against like the two worst team in the league, and the lack of size, the lack of skating. That was really a bit scary for me to rank him too high. But I still like the kid, but I just thought he was just going to be a depth player if he makes it. He still has a chance to make it. He went through waiver in September, didn't get picked, so the jury is still out, I guess. But I like the character on the player, but he just didn't have enough for me to really push for him for our final list. Brad, maybe you can follow here on Pelletier and that kind of player, because there's another player, Jameson Rees, that was kind of like similar. We had Rees a bit higher, average size player that we love the character, but maybe the skill level is not that high, and the skating is also questionable. That's really hard for them to make it to the NHL. Not many of them do.
Yeah, I pushed hard, I remember, on our staff to lower this kid. And the reason why is that almost all of his goals were net front. And it's like, okay, you're dealing with a 5'9" player who's not the most explosive athlete, who tracks very well, but has to deal with a ton of net front traffic theoretically at the pro level against Moritz Seider. And it was like, okay, how in the world is that aspect of his game going to translate to the rate we just saw in junior? And so it's like, okay, well, we got to weight attributes here. We got to really weight his playmaking aggressively now in order for him to compensate, because there's not going to be nearly as many net front goals in his pro career as he's shown here in his first year of junior. And I remember thinking that he was a good playmaker, but nothing more than a good playmaker. He's smart, a good playmaker, but that was not the quality we needed. We need to see a dynamic playmaker, and it wasn't there. So you take that together, and it was like, well, this player is going to be one of those players I think is a better junior player than he's going to be as a pro player. And so far, I think we've hit that mark with him.
Yeah, he's also. I mean, even in the American Hockey League, he has produced, but he has not been able to translate that to the NHL. And obviously, he had one big injury, has hurt his progress, but that's part of the game. If you're gonna be this energy, high character, high compete guy, you're gonna have to play a physical game, whether you give it or receive it. Physical game was gonna find you. And with his frame, that's a bit of an issue. He's not a huge guy. His frame is very, average. So that's a bit of a problem sometimes as scout we can fall in love with those smaller players that work hard and they compete, but sometimes it leads to injury. Anyway, we're gonna move on to the next player. And speaking of high compete, this is not one of them. Archer Kaliyev will not be known as a high compete guy, Brad, took some heat on that one back in 2019 because that kid scored a lot of goals in the OHL, but we just didn't really like this player at all. He went 33rd in the draft with the Kings. We're just, we often talk about what's a hockey prospect, like what's the kind of player we like. Exactly the opposite of Artur Kaliyev, basically. I'll let you start, Brad, on Kaliyev because that's a guy you watch a lot in the OHL. The numbers were great, but we just didn't believe that player was going to be like. We still believe he could play in the NHL somewhat, but not going to be a big, a guy that we can, think about playoff hockey. Like, are we going to be able to count on this guy in the playoff? We didn't think that. So I'll let you start with Mr. Kaliyev.
Well, it's spectrum of outcomes, right, with any of these players. So, for instance, Moritz Seider, we had him closer to where he should be, especially when you look at the consensus rankings publicly, but we're still a bit off in our projection. We didn't see top pairing or a true number one defenseman at that time because of the lack of offensive growth rate and just how difficult it is to predict. However, Artur Kaliyev, I feel like we've hit this out of the park. We thought he'd play. We thought he'd be a depth winger. We thought he'd be a 15 to 20 goal scorer, and we thought he'd play himself right off the team. So far, I mean, it's to a T. We have I think he's on track to really not be with LA much longer here. And he's a perfect example of what real scouting is. Real scouting is when you have to go against a consensus with a 100.50 goal scorer and say he's not going to do what you think he's going to do. That's real scouting. Connor McDavid, you can blindfold a 10-year-old and be like, how good is this kid? How good is Connor McDavid? And everybody's going to tell you he's first overall, right? So like Connor McDavid was the most boring prospect I've ever watched because it was so evident of what he was going to be. Okay, he's the most exciting player I've ever seen, don't be wrong, but the most boring prospect to watch. Artur Kaliyev, however, one of the more exciting prospects to watch because you had everybody who thought he was going to be this dynamic top six, bona fide star player, and he had all the statistics to back it up and this incredible shot. And it was like Alex Ovechkin 2.0, here he comes. And we thought it wasn't going to happen. We thought it was going to be one of those situations where the pace and the defensive liabilities and the lack of forechecking instincts were going to cost him dearly. And one thing about him that's fascinating is that a lot of people that were trying to counter our perspective kept saying, well, he's been much better in skate testing than what your profile has said, because we said he wasn't that great a skater. And people forget skating is not just mechanics. It's not about just power output. It's about when to skate and how hard you're willing to skate. And yes, that ties into compete. And yes, the competitive nature and pacing of a player, I think, is always intertwined and interlinked with skating. But in the case of Kaliyev, he's the best example of this ever. Because, yeah, he had excellent skating tests. So did Jakob Pelletier. Jakob Pelletier had great skating tests. They don't skate the game. They do not skate the game in any capacity. And that's what you need to find. There's a huge difference there between, well, this kid can actually skate relative to can he skate in a hockey game? That's the difference. So, and not to knock LA here. LA did the right thing. LA thought they solidified their draft with Turcotte, with Bjorn Fott. They thought they had high floor players, and rightfully so. At that time, a lot of people in the industry, including us, also thought they had high floor players. When they hit the second round, they looked at the board and said, who's the most dynamic possible talent we can grab here now? Who's the massive swing we can, because they had them put themselves in a position where they could afford to do it. And it was Kaliyev. They had every right to do it. From a draft strategy perspective, LA did everything right. And sometimes it just doesn't work out because of the player, right? So it's, we talked last week about how we get some of these things wrong too. So this isn't like trying to throw Calgary or LA under the bus or anything like that. It's just try to showcase like what we saw in the player and like why we thought they were going to miss and how to interpret it. In terms of any of you listening or younger scouts, or look to see if you can scout, look for the pacing. Look for the attention to detail in their initial draft season off the puck. Do they at least show the instincts for it? That's something Kaliyev didn't show. It's something Jakob Pelletier didn't show. That's Dominic Bach didn't show it. You have to be very careful about that. So there's certain subtle details off the puck that can actually determine the true ceiling of a 50-goal scorer in junior. And that's where scouting gets difficult. It get really, really tricky.
very interesting player. And the Kings got him at 33rd overall. We had him ranked 34. So we still felt like he had too much talent to not play. And at some point, like those players, do you want to play in the NHL or not? Just start give a better effort, and you're gonna play for I don't know how many years. It could be 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, whatever it is. But at some point, players have to decide themselves, like, do I want to play in the NHL or not? And do I want to put the effort into it? And sometimes it's like, do you want to travel first class and make a lot of money in the NHL, or you want to be in the American Hockey League and being on a bus, or being somewhere in Europe and not as fun as maybe the NHL is. So sometimes players they'll have to figure this out by themselves. I think Kaliyev did that, but that doesn't mean he's going to be really a core player at the NHL level. As you see with the Kings, his first season, score 14 goals. So he was a depth player, giving them some goals here and there as a depth player. That's not a bad thing if you get this in the second round of the draft. You're getting an NHL player. His second season was the same thing, and then last season was a bit of a disaster for him, and he has not played yet so far this season. So we talk about you mentioned Brad, like he was gonna run himself out of the team. Looks like it's somewhat happening with him with the Kings, but I think he's got too much talent, too much of a ability to score goals, even as a depth player, that he's going to find himself somewhere else in the NHL. But definitely not exactly the type of player we at Hockey Prospect enjoy scouting and enjoy pushing to rank them high. We're really high, really believer in high compete guy. Whatever your skill level is, obviously, if you have great skills and a great compete, very good chance you're going to be top 10 for us in our rankings. So let's move on, Brad, to your next player, Nils Hoglander from the Vancouver Canucks, who had a really good season last season, scoring almost 25 goals last season. So I'll let you go with Hoglander, maybe what we saw from him back in 2019. Very talented hockey player, undersized, but really high energy also, which obviously we like.
Well, I'll start by saying that he's the opposite of Kaliyev off the ice
Yeah.
in their initial draft season. So one thing with Kaliyev is he was considered a very immature kid, and that was reflected in the interview process, where I know some teams had real issues with how he conducted himself. With Hoglander, you're dealing with a kid who was dialed in, who had a 400-pound squat at the age of 18, which is like ridiculous. Like the heaviest weight I ever lifted was 400. It wasn't 18. It was like 25. And man, it really compresses the spine. Let me tell you, I'm impressed with this kid. He's a physical monster. So Hoglander is a new age type of player. And I think that was one of the reasons he fell. So incredibly dynamic puck handler, one of the best puck handlers in that draft class. Very inventive, creative to a fault. So one thing with Hoglander is he didn't know how to rein in his game. He didn't know how to mitigate risk when he had the puck. There's way too much flash and dash in his game that resulted in turnovers going in the wrong direction when he was in the offensive zone. Now, one thing that I noticed, though, was that this was emphasized internationally, and he would calm it down to a degree when he was playing with Rogla in the SHL. So he had already shown some adaptation to the pro game successfully, which I knew would help him translate. But the huge thing with Hoglander was that he had excellent edge work, but he was phenomenal at understanding how to react properly to incoming resistance against larger defensemen. So like when you have a smaller player, it's always like innately understood from a scouting perspective that that's a disadvantage if you're going up against Keandre Miller style of defenseman. When in reality, if you're a smaller forward and you know how to counterbalance your weight and you know how to have a lower center of gravity and you have excellent, basically base wrestling instincts, I like to call them, for any of you combat aficionados out there, listen to this, like Sambo backgrounds, Judico, anything that forces immediate counter weight transfers, basically Hoglander had that style of instinct ingrained to him so that he could basically take the leverage advantages of a larger defenseman and counteract them entirely so that he could become a dominant down low possession driver. I think that from the people I talked to in the actual industry who are like looking at him, I don't think they looked at it like that. And I'll be honest, I think that's where we kind of got to take an advantage where another example of this is Dmytro Timashov, who was drafted 5th round by Toronto a couple of years back, never made it, but he had a Sambo background and used that to his advantage to counteract resistance and did so successfully. It was just some other aspects that didn't translate. So Denis Yan is another forward who had a Sambo background, Ukrainian and Russian. So yeah, Sambo's big over there in the East. So these types of smaller forwards, you have to see some sort of attribute that will allow them to translate against larger defensemen and then weight that attribute remarkably heavy. So we talked about William Eklund. William Eklund does not counterbalance weight like Hoglander, but he creates fake contact point generation using his stick handling and his length. When he's trying to hold on to possession out of a corner, he'll use his length and his stick timing to try to draw on the defenseman to taking the wrong route against him. Hoglander didn't care. Hoglander would reverse hit into a defenseman, come up underneath him, knock him slightly off balance, time spinning off of the pressure from that defenseman he just knocked off balance and create something out of it. So he knew how to create space. That was the difference. That's why Nils Hoglander has been able to translate at least a moderate level. I'll be honest, he's not off to a great start this season, and there seems to be spurts where he's a bit too inconsistent for his own good. But when he's going and he's playing a very good, heavy, dynamic down-low game, he can be extremely dangerous. And that's what we saw in his draft here, and so far that's translated to the NHL.
Just before we move on to the next player, so Hoglander went 40 in the draft. We had him ranked 23rd. One of our few big win in this class.
Yeah, not many.
We'll take that one. So yeah, Hoglander. We had a lot of time for him in his draft year, even though he was a 5'9", 165-pound player. We like the skill, and we also like the compete that kid had. Also pretty fearless, and obviously in the NHL so far it's been a bit up and down, but he was really good last season, and we're hoping he's going to bounce back a bit after a slow start with the Canucks. And speaking of win, the next player is also another big win by us. Pavel Dorofeyev of the Vegas Golden Knights went 79th in the draft, but we had him ranked 27. So he was in their top. So back then it was a top 31. I believe it was 31 team back then. So 31. So he was in their top 31. So he was a B-rated player, but we had him as a top 31 player. And back then the Russian class was also the Russian factor was pretty big back then. There was like no war or anything like that, but there was no IHF deal with the Russian Federation, so teams were a bit scared of drafting Russians too high in the draft unless they were really, really good. And Dorofeyev was maybe a victim of that. For us, he was a really good talent, but he went in the 3rd round by Vegas, and he is since last year he has really shown like really good stuff at the NHL level. It took a bit longer than maybe we were hoping for, but he's been good for the Golden Knights last season, and he's off to a really good start this year as well. So Brad, you're the Russian expert on our staff, so I'll let you talk here a bit about the Dorofeyev.
Listen, I'm not taking that moniker. We can share that with a couple of people on our staff. And I wouldn't mind getting more Russians right if I'm that. So Dorofeyev, yeah. So pacing of play and skating issues were there. So that's Kaliyev-esque, also Russian. However, the massive difference is when you saw Dorofeyev later in the season, he had improved them, and internationally, they weren't really an issue. So that was more to me, okay, when he's in his team environment, he's not getting coached very well. And then he was also one of the younger players, I think, in that draft. Wasn't he, Jérôme? What birthday was he? I think he was one of the younger kids in the draft. Can't remember off the
Oh
top of my
no,
head.
no. He's actually the opposite. One of the older player. He was a late
There's my false
2000s.
memory. So okay, he was one of the older. I think I thought he was one of the younger players, so I might have given him more leeway. But I guess this worked out in my evaluation. But the huge thing with him was the pacing, the skating. He did improve it over the season. He was better internationally, and he was very, very talented. The other thing with him is there was a bit of jankiness with his coordination in his draft year. He was not totally fully developed or grown into his body. That's like, again, growth rate. He's one of the older players. Maybe this is why I actually thought he was one of the younger players, because I remember distinctly he couldn't chain or skill chain plays together very well. He wasn't one of those players who could keep a puck on a tether, puck on a string, and then link that into his playmaking or shooting nearly the level you'd normally want. But I remember saying to myself, like, if the kid gets physical growth in better physical development, then the physical growth rate can take another notch up. Then he could really become something. I remember that. And that's really the takeaway is looked raw mechanically. Turns out when the mechanics self-correct with age, well, he took off offensively. So also I give like mad props like for Vegas bringing him, they did the right thing. They did what you always want to do with a Russian, which is bring him over pretty early. He's been over for a while. And that's really, I think, a much better way of being able to get some of these Russians to decrease the rate of them bombing out. Because if you bring them over too late, a lot of their skills, it's just so ingrained in what they're doing. It's so hard to like reestablish a base to what they need to do to be successful on North American ice relative to being back home in Russia. So with Dorofeyev, they brought him over early. The physical growth rate improved dramatically. Coordination came up. Offense was there already. They improved the skating. The skating came, and the pace of play is held. So that's the way I look at Dorofeyev. But yeah, falls under the Hoglander category for us, where it's one of a few hits that we'll take.
So I just mentioned he was a late birthday. So can be tricky sometimes because they're too old to play in international tournaments, the U18, but also probably not. In this case, he was not good enough to play for Russia at the U20, so he's kind of stuck in the middle here. And sometimes you can find some really dark horse prospect that are too old for the U18 tournaments, but not good enough for the U20 tournaments. I'm speaking mostly for players in Europe here. So Dorofeyev was in that case where we had to find him in like very obscure tournaments playing for Russia during that year, because he didn't play in the big one, didn't play in the U18, didn't play in the U20. So we had to really work hard to get a good read on him. I think we did at the end, but sometimes those kind of players, sometimes we have to work a bit harder to really figure them out. In his draft year, he played, I guess he split this season between the KHL and the MHL. And obviously in the KHL, like, they don't really play a lot. They sometimes they are dressed, but they don't really play. They get like one or two shifts and they're on the bench most of the game. So even harder for a scout in those circumstances. So that will wrap up for the Dorofeyev. We have a few more players. Maybe Brad, you want to mention here? We're gonna call them the bonus players. Maybe Brad, I'll let you go. I know a few of those names, so I'll let you start like talking about some guys that we got right back in 2019.
Sure. Matias Maccelli had similar numbers to Eric Holla out of the USHL. The big thing with Maccelli was that he was dynamic and at times a brilliant playmaker, but he was small, and in a lot of our staff's viewings lacked the compete threshold needed to really be taken seriously as a prospect. I ended up watching more of him later in the season and seeing that he was actually much more impressive than we expected off the puck. And there was definitely much more of a competitive edge than we had first seen. I'll never forget a sequence with him where he battled against four, I think it was against the program. It was 4 players simultaneously on a penalty kill, and he was successful at pinning the puck down for 45 seconds. I remember telling Mark that. I was like, Mark, there's way more here than we thought. Unfortunately, Mark never got an opportunity to go back and see him and see what I had seen. And so it was one of those situations where the sample was getting updated, and we just ran out of time to really bring it together as a cohesive package on our staff and getting him in the right spot. Another player that I absolutely believe will play, New Jersey fans will know him well, or at least some hardcore fans will know, and that's Arseni Gritsyuk out of Omsk system. So Gritsyuk was a fantastic dual threat, incredibly intelligent player. One of those players where it was like, who do we compare him to recently? Jérôme, Carolina's second-round pick, Swedish, small, Unger Sorum. So this is basically a Russian Felix Unger Sorum. The irony is I think I got this kid right, and then I botched Unger Sorum. So, just embarrassing. Not a good look. Very bad from me to miss out on Unger Sorum, especially with Gritsyuk. So Gritsyuk, again, very intelligent, dominated the States. That was the best program we'd ever seen. He dominated them internationally at the Five Nations. I've never forgotten that. It was one of those situations where could the lack of size and lack of skating power, would that really leave him out of the league long term when you look at it? And it was just all about the growth rate again. It turns out that he's gotten strong and big and thick enough where he's holding the KHL relatively easily, and I think he absolutely will be a top 9 forward for the Devils in the not too distant future if he can come over.
My comp for him was a former New Jersey Devils player, actually kind of funny, Sergei Brylin. Very. We talk about it in one of our first podcasts, talking like different prospect pool for all the teams. So if you want to go look for this on our YouTube channel, it's there. But like, to me, you really reminded me of Sergei Brylin. Very good at everything on the ice, offense, defense, playmaking, can score some goals. So I think when he comes to the NHL, he's going to be a really solid top 9 players that can pretty much play everywhere on your lineup. You need him on your first line. He can play with good players. You need him more as a checker. He can play more of a checking role. I think those players are so valuable. Kind of like Arseni Gritsyuk, kind of like similar to that. So anyway, Brad, do you have any more players that you want to quickly mention here?
Yeah, I'll mention one more player and then discuss something that's kind of interesting about the 2019 draft as a whole. So to start, Dustin Wolf. Dustin Wolf, I'll never forget watching him at 16, and I called Mark and I was like, this kid is super special. Make sure to watch him. Make sure that we monitor him the whole season. And Mark said he was 5'10". I'm not watching him. And I said, okay, I'll watch him for you, and we'll go back to it later in the season. But I really thought he had the potential to be the next UC Saros, and he just beat UC Saros, ironically, in a head-to-head where he pitched a shutout in the best game so far as an NHLer. So he is looking like he is absolutely going to be the next UC Saros. That said, oh man, is goaltending tricky, because I remember in his draft year, he was actually a bit raw. Very good instincts, obviously lightning reflexes, incredibly intelligent goalie, just so good at anticipating the game. However, the post-integration was behind. Certain mechanics were behind all over the map. And one thing that he really has modified his game, and it's the reason he's taken off the NHL, is his inside edge work. He's so good at holding his edges, and he's just so good at laterally transferring on them and remaining upright. And it's just all come together for the kid. I remember on the NHL Network, Craig Conroy had just drafted him, but Craig had not known who he was yet. And Craig had heard I was a goalie guy, so he asked about him. And I said, oh, Craig, 7th round pick, remember that one. That one will come back for you. You're going to be very excited the next year you see him, I promise. And then Craig got excited. He was like, oh, yeah? And then the next year, I got Craig on radio, and sure enough, Craig was definitely very amped up at what he had seen. He knew right there that he had something very special on his hands. One of the best 7th round picks of the last decade. And I bring up the 7th round of the 2019 draft because for it being one of the worst drafts of the decade, it had like the best 7th round I can ever remember, which is like unheard of. Like when did that happen, Jérôme? So like, let's look at some names here. in terms of success rate. Hang on, I gotta.
I'll put them on the screen, Brad.
Let's look at the so. Okay, we have Andre Lee, who is currently playing full-time in a depth role in LA, and I have spoken to some LA staff, and they're very high on him sticking long-term. Okay, and then you have Raphael Harvey-Pinard, Jérôme, who maybe you can touch on. You know him well. Trent Miner just got called up. Valtteri Puustinen now has really become a very interesting depth forward for Pittsburgh that I think might have a chance to actually hold long term. And Vadim Zarenko out of St. Louis, one of the better, I think, 7th-round goalie picks I can remember. I really believe Vadim Zarenko can be at least a backup in the NHL long term. I know he's not off to a great start this year, but give him a bit of time. And then Juuso Parssinen. Nashville did a fantastic job there. His toolkit was incredible. I actually have games of him when he was playing in Liga for the scouting school I'm building because he's so interesting to watch in his initial draft season. And then, of course, we talked about Dustin Wolf. So you look at that 7th round in like what is arguably one of the worst drafts I can ever remember. Like it's just uncanny. You never see that. You literally never see a draft that bad with so many players in the 7th round that look like they actually might be okay, or in some cases like stars. Like Dustin Wolf's going to be a star goalie. It's just unheard of.
All right, I think that's gonna wrap up this week episode. Just a reminder, guys. Next week we're gonna be back talking NHL Draft. It's gonna be the release of our first NHL Draft ranking of this season. So Monday, November 25th will be when we release the list. So that week, our podcast will be, we're going to talk about it. So we're going to talk about that ranking in that week. And I think the next few weeks after that, also, we might try to get some of our scouts, join the show here with us. So we're going to discuss maybe some leagues more, so like the WHL or USHL, NTDP. So we're going to discuss that. So if you have any question, any comments, don't be shy. You can leave them in the comment section on YouTube. Like I said last week, I think if we get enough question at some point, we might do like a mailbag episode so we can answer some of your question. So until then, we'll take a few days off here, and we'll be back next week talking NHL Draft. Brad, I once again, thank you for joining me today, and we'll see all of you guys next week.
Take care, everyone.